The world's full of elites. It's full of experts. Everybody claiming that they know more about something than you. But ladies and gentlemen, what you're going to hear about now is actually the words and advice of someone that I do think is an expert on AI. And you might ask yourself, how can somebody be an expert on AI? Well, the reality is AI has been with us a lot longer than ChatGPT. Ladies and gentlemen, AI has been there since we've had machine learning. And the man called Toby Walsh was somebody who's been studying AI and its potentials for over 25 years. In fact, he's a professor of AI at the University of New South Wales, and he spoke to the press club in Canberra on the need for governments to regulate AI. Matt, welcome back to Boon or Bust.
Thank you, Peter. Great to be here.
Well, and let me tell you what his view of AI was in his thing. And remember, this is a guy that's been studying it for a long time. He says we need to regulate AI to prevent real demonstrable harms that it can create. Matt, what's your thought on that?
Regulate AI to prevent demonstrable harm. It's an interesting point, Peter, because when I think about regulation, you want to make sure that you're protecting people but not holding people back, right? And I think the point you made there, that who is an AI expert given where we are today, and obviously Toby's been following this for a very long time. My only challenge with guardrails in general is that they stop the very thing we need to accelerate here in Australia, and that's innovation and productivity.
Yeah, but let's look at Australia and let's look at AI in specific, and let's think of some of the harms that AI can create. I know personally the dangers of deepfakes, where somebody can impersonate somebody else through AI and get you to do something you don't want to do. We've seen in Australia Robodebt, where we falsely believed the values that were created by an AI model, and people committed suicide because those values were not correct and they were forcing them to pay debts they didn't have. So we know that, we see the fake news every day. People creating imagery that's not true, that you are trying to be misled with. So the AI is a dangerous thing, Matt.
It is. I would say in general, though, Peter, that when you look back through time and through history with most technologies, there's always been this kind of question.
Yeah.
What guardrails do we need to put in place here? Whether it's with, data going overseas or data going out of your own accounts into other sort of environments as well. There's always been that need to sort of control in many ways. So I think AI kind of moves all that on steroids.
Well, and then the question comes, who puts those controls in? Is it the people who buy an AI product that create the AI guardrails themselves and create a culture of how it's used? Or is it a government that says, everybody using AIs, these are the guardrails that will judge its use? Because I just want to come in on the government one, because the world is now awash with all these libertarians who tell us the last thing we need is more government involvement. Government ends up, it's what they say about the camel, it's the horse designed by the committee or by the government. You've got this image of governments controlling us. We want to be unshackled, as you said, to have to harness the ingenuity or innovation potential of AI.
There's two things in my head at the moment, Peter. So we talk about whether government can only, you called out Robodebt,
Yeah.
The challenge we saw with that, has that kind of limited the perception that the government is actually the right person to do this? You've talked about libertarians, right, saying we don't need more government control. Who are the libertarians?
The big tech companies.
Indeed. Are they libertarians or are they self-serving money makers at the end of the day? So I think that, my point here is that, how do we identify the right people for this? And I think also, while AI and indeed quantum coming down the track takes us to a whole new level, the fundamentals of why we need guardrails haven't changed, whatever the technology is. It's to protect individuals.
Which is actually one of the duties of any government. It is actually to protect its citizens from harm. But I think it's the argument, why should government do it, not people? And my argument to that is government gives a consistent view across organizations. So you get a mandate from a government to do something. We all have to do it. So we all behave the same way. It gives a consistency. If we don't have government doing it, it's left to individuals. We get different interpretations of what's safe and what's not.
Yeah, but you mentioned Toby Walsh, right? Very preeminent in this area in general. So I think that it's not that government needs to identify what the guardrails need to be. Government needs to make sure they're implemented. People like Toby Walsh need to identify what the guardrails should be, and then government needs to implement it.
Well, then you need to legislate for it. But Matt, let's look at another invention which has changed humankind, and that's the motor car. And let's, for argument's sake, let's say the motor car started in 1900. It actually started a few years before it, but it gives us a sort of round number to sort of lean back on. 125 years ago, we've had the motor car, and you just start to think of the legislation that has been introduced for the safe use of a motor car. And you think about seatbelts, you think about drink driving laws, you think about restrictions on using mobile phones, you think about the car's suitability to be on the road, to certify it, speed limits, speed traps. These sorts of things have all been designed to protect people from the harms that the motor car could do.
They have, and you can use tobacco as another example as well, Peter. But I would say to you here that I totally agree. They've all been put in place to protect the drivers, to protect citizens, but they were only put in place after a whole lot of people died.
Yeah.
Right. So this was not this was not kind of thinking forward.
No.
This was retrospective kind of thinking. And I think with AI, or indeed quantum coming down the track, so how do we know what challenges we're going to face? How do we know the impact it's going to have? So, or do we just learn along the way, and do we put the guardrails and governance in place as challenges arise? Because we don't know what the challenges are going to be. Peter.
But here's the scary thing, Matt. The scary thing is that the speed of business is accelerating exponentially through AI. The motor car, we were starting with vehicles able to do 10 miles an hour, then 20 miles an hour. So the evolution of the motor car enabled governments to sort of keep up with it. What I'm worried about with AI and quantum, we're going to be left in the dust with the changes that they're going to bring.
We are, and I think, again, coming back to, not wanting to get too political here, but you think about the whole tobacco scenario. Why was legislation not put in place earlier?
Yeah.
Now, why?
Well, because people pushed back on it. The tobacco companies, they challenged scientific thinking about the dangers of smoking.
Because of the very deep pockets they had,
Yes.
they could do that. And
That's
they could
right.
tie things up for years and years. So the libertarians that you spoke of, Peter, can they not do the same thing?
Absolutely.
They don't want guardrails or governments in place because it's going to hit them in the pocket.
And then the danger of that, Matt, is that those people with deep pockets can actually be funding political parties through the donations. So they're influencing opinion based on the money that they're giving to those political parties. But sometimes we require governments to step up and do things. So, for example, why should a piece of software that allows you to undress a female student in a school, why is that allowed to be a piece of software that people can buy? Why isn't that banned?
It should be banned, but why is that allowed in the first place? And there's many examples of things like that, Peter.
Because
in general.
somebody thought it was funny and they created it.
But then is that then not the responsibility of your libertarians to think, you know what, that's wrong? I need to stop that.
But they don't think that way.
I know
Matt.
they don't. I know.
They think my freedom is what I want.
Indeed, I know that's right. And therein lies the challenge at the end of the day, right? So how on earth do we keep ahead of these things? I think is a question. And I think that's why I came back to, the academics or whatever. The people like Toby Walsh, for example. Maybe they're best placed to think about what could happen, because we need to think about not what's happening. We need to think what could happen. And what can we learn from that to put the guardrails in place today?
Well, and you were sort of saying there with the motor cars, there were a lot of deaths, and then we introduced legislation to try and prevent those deaths happening in the future. I think even though AI and quantum is accelerating the pace of business, we've got to recognize when harms are happening that we need some way to create legislation quickly to address that.
So why can't we just ask ChatGPT to tell us?
It might be a bit subjective in its thinking, Matt, you know?
It might be, that's right.
But I mean, I think, but I look at that examples, for example, in deepfake crimes. You know, what are jurisdictions starting to do around the world to try and prevent that? They're trying to legislate that financial institutions which allow people whose customers are deceived by deepfakes have responsibility to protect those customers of theirs. And if there is a loss, people lose money through these deepfakes, that the financial institutions pay a cost for it. Now, that would change behavior in what people allow on their platforms.
Absolutely. And I think, again, you know, coming back to what Toby Walsh was talking about as well at the press club, he said that, and you know, it's kind of a bugbear of mine, Peter, in general, in terms of our challenges around innovation and productivity in Australia. And the reason I'm not pushing back on guardrails, I just want to make sure that it's not coming at the expense of holding us back as a nation. And Toby Walsh, in his speech, he basically said it's not about stopping innovation. It's about steering innovation.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
That point he made. It's about steering innovation with guardrails. I'll add that on the end of that.
Well, but Matt, and I get back to my camel as a horse designed by the government. You know, do we think government has got that creativity to know what's innovative and not, to help encourage the innovation? That's got to come from individuals.
That's the point I'm making. We're making here. That's where it needs to come. So it's not necessarily a steering committee, right? But you need the right experts, the right people. I heard from John Whittle as well when I was in Canberra a few weeks ago from Data 61, and you know he was talking about the need to encourage use. We need to encourage use to accelerate innovation, and we need to encourage use to, going back to what we talked about before, remove friction to free us up to focus on innovation, but at the same time making sure that we're doing that with, you know, steering around that as well.
Yeah, well, and I think that idea is where we need to go. We need to recognize it's not having the magic solution immediately to some of these challenges, but it's providing some sort of framework that we can then start to tweak and adjust things as we go on. But being cognizant that there are a lot of vested interests who basically want this to be free reign because they make a lot of money through advertising.
We've got some brilliant minds here in Australia, you know. And obviously you talk about people like Toby Walsh. I mentioned John Whittle. There's many others as well. Get these people together in a room, you know, work it out together collectively. I think is probably what we need to be thinking about.
Well, I worry about that though, Matt. You know, you start to bring lots of people together and try to get consensus. It's not very easy at times. I think sometimes the task of government is to hear lots of voices, but actually pull together the consolidated view of those people.
But they've got to make sure they've got the right credentials and capabilities to be able to do that.
Well,
effectively, Peter. And I think it needs to be not a self-serving government or vendor who's looking at this.
No.
It needs to be kind of bipartisan approach to this in many ways as well.
Well, but you've always said to me, Matt, the vendors got a stake in this game. They've got views and thoughts that we need to be able to listen to as well. We need to recognise there's vested interest in their own deep pockets, but also recognise that they are working with this. They're creating these products. They probably understand their capabilities more than most people.
They do. So you've got to identify within those particular, you know, we're not bagging vendors here, we're just giving advice, but within those particular vendors, who are the right people? You know, they've all got sort of these evangelists in most of these vendors.
Yeah.
Give them the opportunity to sort of help shape what this should look like. But I think at the end of the day also, for many people in the private sector, and indeed government as well, Peter, they would be reticent to speak their own mind and their own view
Exactly.
if it's not in line with what the corporate position is.
That's right. That's right. I couldn't agree more with that. I think one other thing, Matt, is that we got to recognise in Australia that we are just one country about 200 countries in the world. And so be attuned to what other jurisdictions are doing around the world, what works, what's not worked. I mean, Australia was the catalyst for the social media ban for under 16-year-olds. And I think a lot of people said that's an idea worth exploring. We need to sort of be curious about looking what other people are doing to regulate their use of AI.
Now, here's an idea based on what we spoke about on one of the other sessions, Peter, was why don't we look across the globe, across all the different IT analysts out there? Who are the IT analysts leading an area like AI or leading quantum in each of the major geographies?
Yeah.
And why don't we bring them together? You know, what a great opportunity to get their thinking and their mind. So one thing about being an analyst is generally we will come to a consensus agreement on things and form a position because that's what's built into us to do. So I think that I would challenge Forrester, IDC, Gartner, Adapt even, you know, all of these sort of vendor IT analyst organizations. Can we identify an individual? Can we take them out of their day-to-day? Can we put them in an environment, a virtual environment, to actually work on this collectively and come up with what they believe should be the right approach to guardrails?
And Matt, I like that idea because it's actually recognizing that the whole concept of technology, how technology is changing the lives of people. And I think one of the challenges or frustrations I have with governments around the world is they are too slow to recognize that the world is changing. The world they're governing is changing. Technology is changing the landscape that people are living and working in. And we need to recognize how do we get independent thoughts and views that we can sort of put the guardrails around that.
And I think we also need to recognise this isn't an Australian problem.
No.
It's not an American problem. You know, it's not a Singaporean problem. It's a collective problem. And again, what we find ourselves creating, Peter, across the globe are these silos of safety, if you like, with guardrails. So what we want to make sure we avoid is that we don't have these silos of safety in Australia, silos of safety in the US.
Yeah.
How do we kind of put more of an umbrella approach across all the so-called democracies around the world to have a common approach to AI?
Well, and also recognize, Matt, that there's no immediate solution to it. You don't come up with some magic bullet that solves all the problems. This is something we're going to have to tweak and tune and refine as we go on, but we've got to have the framework in place that we can start to get that insight as things have changed through new developments in technology. What does that mean? How can we do things differently? So I think it's recognizing, keeping an open mind, being evolving, but recognizing that this is a task that we need to have our governments involved in, because this is so important to the lives of many people.
It is, and as you say, it needs to be an iterative approach in many ways, not a one-off approach. And I'll come back to, you know, your car analogy, right? We want to make sure that people are continuing to grow and evolve their knowledge and understanding as models change and evolve, just as government has to, because, you know, we can have the latest and greatest safety technologies in cars and we're all safely driving around. But then when old mate comes out in a 1965 Tirana or whatever, then the safety conversation goes out the window.
Well, that's right. The glorious car, though, Matt, to look at it in some ways.
Now, all those car buffs are going to say it wasn't a 1965. It was way later than that, Matt.
Yeah. But, Matt, there's also something else I think that's important in this. And getting back to this point that one of the tasks of governments is to create a world that's safe for its citizens. And I think part of the challenge we've got to recognize is that there are people being harmed today by technology. We are seeing mental health problems. We are seeing teenage suicides from this. These things are happening for us. So it is a task that government's got to recognize. If you see one of your priorities is the safety of your people, then you need to recognize that you need to play an active part in the regulations to make sure their world is safe.
But I think accountability cuts across many, many different swathes of, the marketplace in general, Peter. So you can talk about, you know, governments having a responsibility for the safety of their citizens. I think part of this discussion around guardrails is that the creators of the technology need to also have accountability and responsibility for the safety of their users. And you love that term, I know. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, but then that comes to the task of what does that accountability mean? And for me, it means that fines, penalties, possibly even prison sentences for inappropriate use of...
Just as we've done with cyber.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we've made it a board level, as we talked about, kind of imperative and issue is that the board becomes liable, essentially, if they're not putting the right cyber capabilities in place.
This is something that we've got to recognise. We're not looking for a silver bullet to solve things, but we need to have a mindset which says, what can we do to make the world safer with the use of AI?
Yeah, and I would say guardrails are imperative in so many ways. Guardrails are absolutely critical to not just the safe use of AI and indeed all other technologies, but they're critical in terms of ensuring the safety collectively of our people in Australia and more broadly.
Well, and then getting back finally to that car analogy, cars are safer now than they were when I was growing up, and because they're they're safer because we've established road rules, and we give people more confidence to drive because they have those safety protections.
Yep.